Good afternoon to all of you, my dear students. As I told you all earlier, that we'll be interacting in the next class about Pride and Prejudice, the novel written by Jane Austen. If you remember, when we were learning about history of English literature, I told you about the French Revolution and the impact of Romanticism on Jane Austen. The French Revolution began in 1789 on July 14th, of which year the Bastille was stormed and the King Louis XVI was removed from the court at Versailles. The revolution then moved through several increasingly radical phases, beginning with the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, going on to the eventual abolitions of the monarchy and the executions of the king. Followed by the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1793, only the establishment of a new government called the Directory and the eventual rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who became emperor in 1804. The French Revolution greatly influenced British politics and philosophy at the time. But there was a gradual shift away from the earlier enthusiasm with which English radicals like Paine and Godwin had greeted it. Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, is proof of this. Paine replied to this work with The Right of Man, 1791, thus setting off a long lasting debate between conservative and radical thinkers. Wordsworth and Coleridge, interestingly, were both to eventually change their minds about the French Revolution, as they were forced to acknowledge that far from its professed aims of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it had come to mean anarchy and cruelty. The Enlightenment was at its height. The Enlightenment is the name commonly given to an intellectual movement, usually associated with the 18th century, though its origin can be tracked back to a period earlier than that. Its most important feature is a belief in reason as a defining characteristics of human beings. Along with this goes the idea that the reason, if correctly used, is the right weapon against superstitions and tyranny. Reason is thus considered perfectly consistent with revolution. The roots of the Enlightenment have been traced by some scholars to a period as far as back as the 13th century, which saw a renewed interest in and appropriation of Aristotelian logic by the medieval scholastic theologians. Thomas Aquinas, who used the logical procedures elaborated by Aristotle to define the dogma of Christianity, thus bringing together two concepts, those of faith and logic, which had been largely polarized before this period. This method of using logic could not, however, remain confined to the church purpose of upholding its teachings, and as had happened in the pagan culture of its origin, it eventually began to use to question traditional ideas and beliefs. The Renaissance, the Renaissance humanists, a group of thinkers in Italy and France in 14th century, argued that the proper worship of God requires an admiration of His creation and especially of humanity. As the crown of that creation, of all creation, humanity alone has the power of creation, and since this power is seen as a divine one, humans are therefore not only created in the image of God but also share His creative power. Reason in the Enlightenment usually refers to common sense, powers of observation and deduction, and skepticism in thought, and the exercise of this faculty becomes a moral duty for human beings. This was, however, only one trend of thought in the 17th century, and one by no means strong enough to overcome the dogma and fanaticism which manifested itself in witch hunts and wars of religion and of imperial conquest. The idea of nature inherited along with other Renaissance absolutes of conquest, absolutes of goodness, truth, and reason, is not during this period a fixed of uniform, a fixed of The idea of nature inherited along with the other renaissance absolute of goodness, truth, and reason is not during this period a fixed or uniform one and continues to change and revolve with the time. To begin with, it means whatever is original and precedes culture or human civilization, but this soon gives way to a different conception that sees the fullest development of nature in art and civilization. A third view is that of nature as an inner moral law that is imprinted in the minds of human beings. Nature is thus appropriated by very different and often mutually opposed streams of thought and variously made to fit the purpose of ethics, satire, science, religion, and politics. Neoclassicism and literary movement that advocated the close study of and imitation of classical writers, especially the Romans, extended the pursuit of balance and propositions of literature. Writers like Dryden, Pope, Johnson emphasized the need for others, needs for emphasize the need for order and harmony as a safeguard against the folly and excess to which human society is prone. One of the concerns the closely identified with Enlightenment thought is the epistemological strain that studies the concept, the nature, and the philosophy extent of human knowledge. The main question posed by this kind of philosophic thoughts are what it means to know something, whether we can know anything at all, and if so, how much and in what ways. Knowledge is how conceived as a conceptual category rather than a quantifiable entity. Truth cannot be demonstrably proven or asserted, but could be recognized instead as a relative and culturally contingent idea. It follows that if truth or virtue is not an eternally relevant absolute, that morality has become relative and cannot be imposed on anyone. So, my dear students, good sense is of all things in the world the most equally distributed for everybody, thinks himself so abundantly provided with it that even those most difficult to please in all other matters do not commonly desire more of it than they already possess. So we already know what is the Romanticism, Jane's work in the context of Romantic movement. Jane Austen's work does take into account the two opposing sets of impulse that emerged in the two decades, 1798 to 1818, when she wrote most of her novels. This is a transitional period of English literature, since it combined the 18th century concern with the social context of human beings with a romantic emphasis on the individual self in isolation. Individual self in isolation. Meenakshi Mukherjee says Jane Austen's major contribution as the extension of the self, which had so far been all male to include women. Jane Austen wrote and published her novels when the romantic movement in literature had begun to emerge. Though her novels are usually read as part of the 18th century tradition of reason and good sense, which this movement reacted against. She ridicules the lack of realism, falsities of sentiment, and lack of psychological veracity in the treatment of character in the in the novels of sensibility and the Gothic novels, which enjoyed great popularity in her time. Her first novel, Northanger Abbey, published in 1817 after her death, exposes through parody the sentiments and perceptions associated with the Gothic romances and Sense and Sensibility 1811. Similarly, points out the danger of an uncritical acceptance of the cult of sensibility. Jane Austen's refusal to include magical, miraculous, or fanatic or fantastic elements in her writing, her distrust of emotional effusiveness, and a choice of ordinary human beings instead of grand or heroic figures. Remember, William Wordsworth also believed in that choice of common people. Her choice of ordinary human beings instead of grand or heroic figures as characters for her novels must be seen in the context of the rise of the novel earlier in 18th century. When realism intended to affirm when realism intended to affirm a scientific outlook and democratic values, the newly ascendant middle classes defined these against the fatalism and mysticism of the romances. But romanticism is more than a reassertion of outmoded and earlier discarded irrationalities. It also voices dissatisfaction with the inherited ideals of rationality and good sense. The instinctive and passional self of romantic literature also repudiates what it saw as the repressive and qualified uniformity of these ideals. Jane Austen has been, on the one hand, accused of ignoring these aspects of romanticism and, on the other, identified as one of its initiators in the said genre of fiction. The rise of novel, the emergence of the novel as a form of realistic narrative in the 18th century came about with an acceleration in the changes that had been taking place in the social structure of Europe since the Renaissance. The narrative form of romance represented the values and attitude of a feudal society, both hierarchical and relatively static, which was challenged by the expansions of market forces. Classes and groups associated with trade and manufactures now gained ascendancy in society, a development that brought along a confidence in human power to change one's own existence or destiny. Jane Austen was born on 16th of December 1775 at Steventon in Hampshire. She was the seventh of the eight children and the second daughter of Reverend George Austen, who was the local rector, and his wife Cassandra Neely. Jane Austen's father had a fairly respectable income of about £600 a year and belonged to the landed gentry, but was certainly not a rich man. Just pay attention to this because we'll be coming back with reference to your text of the Pride and Prejudice. I'm repeating. Jane Austen was born on 16th of December 1775 at Steventon in Hampshire. She was the seventh of the eight children and second daughter of Reverend George Austen, who was the local rector, and his wife Cassandra. Jane Austen's father had a fairly respectable income of about £600 a year and belonged to the landed gentry, but was certainly not a rich man. His wife, however, belonged to a family, the Lees, which was proud of its aristocratic links. The mother was from the Lee family, and these Lee peoples were proud of their aristocratic links. His wife, however, belonged to a family, the Lees, which was proud of its aristocratic links. Since the couple ran a boys' school at the parsonage where they lived, Jane and her brothers and sister grew up alongside the students, and as a child, Jane was like Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, both fond of and well acquainted with boys' games. In 1783, when Jane was 8 years old, she was sent along with her sister Cassandra to a school run by a Mrs. Cowley, who was the sister of one of their uncles, first in Southampton and later in Oxford. But they returned home after an infectious disease broke out at the school. 2 years later, in 1785, now we have the corona infectious disease in the society. 2 years later, in 1785, they were sent to the Abbey boarding schools in Reading, on which Mrs. Goddard school in Emma is supposedly based, in her parents' opinion. Jane was actually too young to go to school, but reportedly insisted on accompanying Cassandra, from whom she was inseparable. Her mother said of the situation that if Cassandra's head had been going to be cut off, Jane would have her cut off too. Except for the short periods of the time she spent at these schools, Jane Austen received no other formal education outside her family. Just see, understand that. Cassandra, from whom she was inseparable. Her mother said of the situation that if Cassandra's had been going to be cut off, Jane would have her cut off too. So, my dear students, this lady, Cassandra, Mrs. Bennet, asks her 5 daughters to hunt for the groom. And in the locality of Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Bennet, Mr. Bingley and family came. And the mother emphasized, go and find the groom because they are wealthy and having a lot of property. See, the thought may be negative according to the values. But when the question comes of feminism, because my dear students, this is related to the feminism, where the women writer, women novelist, Jane Austen is writing about women. Nari Sasastikar, to empower the women, to give the women strength, make them bold, brave, and unable to do something great in the society. The mother is from an aristocratic family and father is very poor. He's not able to do the things as one is supposed to get. So mother enables the children, especially the female, to hunt for the groom and prove. You'll find here a lot of things like Elizabeth dances in a ball and William Fitzgerald Darcy proposes her. So what I'm trying to say you, just because in this novel we find how the women is emphasizing, how the mother is emphasizing the daughter to get power and property in the society. So my dear students, this novel will enable you to have power, enable you to be bold, brave, and powerful enough, and understand your identity, to know your self from the within. The Enlightenment is looked at as the manifestations of the intellectual and political conditions prevalent in Europe during the course of the 18th century. Jane Austen's work is then considered in the context of the Romantic movement which begins to emerge at this moment in history. Secondly, the rise of the novel and of the genre of realist fiction to which Jane Austen's work belongs, are traced with a view to placing her work within a certain literary tradition, and also looking at the ways in which it is constitutive of that tradition. Consciousness of one's perceived states, the quality or condition of viewing things exclusively through the medium of one's own mind or individuality. So it will emphasize on individuality. And this is a universal kind of novel. What is applicable to or involves all the individuals or species of a class or genius, an abstract or general concept, regarded as having an absolute mental or nominal existence. Jane Austen's treatment of pride as a theme. Jane Austen's treatment of pride as a theme became more easily intelligible to us when we see her work in the context of 18th century traditions of the realistic novel, because of the rational and secular framework of the outlook of Enlightenment humanism. Pride is not presented here in theological terms as a sin, but is seen as a common and verifiable fact of human experience. which can be analyzed and understood through reasoning. That means you have to understand your strength, your inner self, what you are, what you can do, and how strong you are, and how strong you can build yourself. All these things are very important. The 18th century also witnessed the emergence of the new sides of human psychology, where human experiences, ideas, feelings, emotions, and experiences in society begin to be studied with the help of methods and concepts used by physical scientists in their study of natural phenomena, parallel to the concept of matter as a substance which, despite changes in its form, remained essentially the same everywhere. This new science goes along with and perhaps even leads to the evolution of a concept of universal human nature by thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Hume. Human traits in the physical sciences, elements are classified under different categories such as metals and non-metals, gases and solids, and are regarded as the basic units of matter which through different combinations form the various substances found in nature. Human nature, if similarly considered, human nature, we are learning the human nature, always bear in mind. Human nature, if similarly considered, could be seen as consisting of some basic traits which combine in different proportions and combinations to form the personalities of different individuals. Human nature, if similarly considered, could be seen as consisting of some basic traits which combine in different proportions and combinations to form the personalities of different individuals. Human traits. Human traits are similarly placed in the categories of appetites, impressions, sensations, passions, and ideas. In the analysis of a compound, an important part of the job is to break it up into its elements and see how these elements interact with one another. A similar model begins at this time to be used for human personality, which is studied by breaking it up into the traits mentioned above and seeing how they interact with one another in order to produce the specific human personality under study. Jane Austen's treatment of pride conforms to this pattern of scientific and rational analysis. Jane Austen's treatment of pride and prejudice. So, what is pride? जब लड़का पैसा वाला होता है तो सोचता है मैं पैसे वाला हूं तो मुझे तो बहुत सारी लड़कियां मिल जाएंगी शादी करने के लिए, मुझे कोई दिक्कत नहीं है, तो वो घमंडी हो जाता है. प्राइड. जब लड़कियों के पास बहुत ज़्यादा सुंदर होती हैं, स्मार्ट होती हैं, इंटेलेक्चुअल्स होती हैं, तो उनके अंदर भी घमंड आ जाता है कि मेरे पीछे भी बहुत हैं, मैं भी किसी से भी शादी कर सकती हूँ. दिस इज. लेकिन जब वो अगर लड़का पैसे वाला है लेकिन लड़की की गरीब गांव या किसी बिलोनिया या किसी जुलाई बारी के गांव की है और वो अगरतला में किसी धनवान व्यक्ति के बच्चे से शादी करने लगे तो लोग मना कर देते हैं. क्यों? क्योंकि प्रेजुडाइज. कौन करेगा उन गांव वालों से? प्राइड एंड प्रेजुडाइज. सो जेन ऑस्टेन्स ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ प्राइड. चांदी की दीवार न तोड़ी, प्यार भरा दिल तोड़ दिया, एक धनवान की बेटी ने एक निर्धन का दिल तोड़ दिया. दिस इज अगेन प्राइड एंड प्रेजुडाइज. Jane Austen's treatment of pride conforms to this pattern of scientific and rational analysis. Commenting on pride, David Hume underlines its two special attributes. In a treatise of human nature, he tells us that as against passions like love, where the self draws pleasure from its orientation toward others. My dear students, pay attention. David Hume underlines its two special attributes in Treatise of Human Nature. He tells us that as against passions like love, where the self draws pleasure from its orientations towards others, the object of pride is the self alone. The object of pride is the self alone. Pride is then, in other words, a form of excessive self-absorption, self-centeredness, self-regard, self-esteem, self-restraint, self-sufficient. The object of pride is the self alone. Pride is then, in other words, a form of excessive self absorption, self centeredness, self regard, self respect, or self esteem. The second attribute of pride, according to David Hume, is that unlike hunger, bhook, greed, lalach, and lust, vashna, the second attribute, second gun, दूसरा गुण जो है, the second attribute of the pride, according to him, is that unlike hunger, greed, and lust, pride does not arise from specific bodily organs or the needs of the self, but it is pleasurable to the self by virtue of demonstrable externals which are seen as possessions, which they are mental or physical possessions. Jane Austen's treatment of pride shows its different varieties, where both these attributes are clearly visible to a greater or lesser degree. So you might have understood now what is the pride. In the book A Treatise of Human Nature, David Hume tells us that, as against passions like love, where the self draws pleasure from its orientation towards other, the object of pride is the self alone. Pride is then, in other words, a form of excessive self-absorption, self-centeredness, self-respect, self-regard, self-reliant, self-sufficient, or self-esteem. The second attribute of pride, according to David Hume, is that unlike hunger, greed, and lust, pride does not arise from specific bodily organs or the needs of the self, but it is pleasurable to the self by virtue of demonstrable external which are seen as possessions, whether they are mental or physical possessions. Jane Austen's treatment of pride shows its different varieties, where both these attributes are clearly visible to a greater or lesser degree. Title. The title of the novel is Pride and Prejudice. Initially, it was the first impression, but she changed later on. The title of the novel may not provide an instant clue to the meaning of the text, but it does indicate at least one theme in the fairly unambiguous terms, offering an indications to the text's chief concern as well as useful starting point of a study of them. The title should not be misread. The title of this book, Pride and Prejudice, the title should not be misread to mean that Jane Austen is dealing here with two entities called Pride and Prejudice, which are independent of each other and exist separately in personality and behavior of different characters. But I would like to say you, my dear, when Darcy proposed to Elizabeth that I want to get married, when Bingley asked Darcy that you can dance with Elizabeth, she is one of the most beautiful, and Bingley was dancing with Jane, the elder sister of Elizabeth Bennet. Then Darcy said, she is not, the word is written over here badly because it should be she is not beautiful enough, but in the novel, Jane Austen has written, she is not handsome enough to tempt me. Instead, it should be she is not beautiful enough to tempt me. That means it was the pride was there in Bingley, in Darcy at the time. He said to Bingley that she is not handsome enough to tempt me. So घमंडी कौन है? The boy was Proudy at the time. The title should not be misread to mean that Jane Austen is dealing with her with two entities called Pride and Prejudice, which are independent of each other and exist separately in the personality and behavior of different characters. Again, what happened? At last, when Elizabeth brought her to that standard, when when she became the most beautiful and she learned the etiquettes and the mannerism, like Prioress, you have already learnt in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Prioress, when she used to eat, not even a single morsel used to fall on her cloth. जब प्रायरस खाना खाती थी तो उसकी उंगलियां उसमें नहीं डूबती थी. किसमें नहीं डूबती थी? उनकी उंगलियां बाउल में नहीं डूबती थी, और जब वो खाती थी तो बूंद या कोई भी खाने का एक भी अंश उसके कपड़ों पर नहीं पड़ता था. When Paris used to eat, not even a single morsel used to fall on her. When she learned manners, etiquettes, and the positive and the best traits, at the time, now Darcy was running behind and Elizabeth became proud. So this is the Pride and the Prejudice.